In a high-stakes showdown on Capitol Hill, Jasmine Crockett confronts Joe Manchin, exposing deep corruption hidden behind political power. As the truth unravels, Crockett reveals shocking ties to millions of dollars in undisclosed deals with fossil fuel giants, threatening the very foundation of Manchin's career. With the clock ticking, emotions run high as each side battles for control, one seeking justice, the other fighting to protect decades of power. As the investigation looms, will Crockett succeed in holding Manchin accountable for his conflicts of interest, or will the system protect him once again? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the harsh white lights of room 226 on Capitol Hill, the chamber filled slowly, buzzing with tension that clung to the air like static before a storm. Reporters lined the back wall, fingers poised over keyboards. Cameras blinked red, ready to broadcast every breath. The hearing's title glowed on the front monitor: The Hidden Cost, Personal Interests in National Energy Policy. Chairman Halloran adjusted his microphone with a slow, deliberate hand. "Let the record show," he began. "This session of the Oversight Committee is now in order." The room hushed. He leaned forward. "Today we examine whether private profit has steered public policy. Our witness, former Senate Energy Chair, Senator Joseph Manchin." At the sound of that name, the temperature seemed to drop. The double doors creaked open, and Joe Manchin entered, with the ease of a man who had walked these halls longer than some members had been alive. His suit was a pristine charcoal gray, his tie the color of dried blood. He moved like a heavyweight entering the ring, not with brute force, but with the calm swagger of practiced dominance. At the witness table, he paused, offered a half smile, and let his eyes drift confidently across the panel. "I'm here today not to play party games," he said smoothly, "but to speak the truth, no matter how inconvenient." A few members nodded, not all. At the far right side of the U-shaped desk, barely within the C-SPAN frame, sat Representative Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch, didn't smile, just kept writing. The chair recognized Manchin with formal courtesy, but eyes were already beginning to flicker down the row, toward the woman in the sharp navy blazer with a single silver Texas pin on her lapel. Jasmine Crockett was new, young, bold, some whispered, and she had been seated at the far end, not by oversight, but by tradition. Seniority had its pecking order. Still, she sat with her back straight, elbows tucked, fingers stained from morning research. She wasn't a rookie. She was a fuse waiting for spark. Every word Manchin uttered, she marked, not out of fear, not out of awe, but with the clinical precision of someone waiting for the perfect opening to strike. As Manchin began to recount his record, citing legislation passed, coal jobs preserved, and rural communities defended, the camera slowly zoomed in on his face. He gestured with the gravitas of an elder statesman, weaving the narrative like a man who'd told this story 1,000 times. "Over the course of my public service, I've stood where it counts, on the side of working families, not political fads. I've authored legislation that saved thousands of coal jobs, protected rural livelihoods, and kept this country from becoming dependent on foreign energy. We talk about clean energy, and sure, we all want a better future, but not at the expense of West Virginia families. Not by bulldozing our economy to satisfy some academic fantasy cooked up in coastal boardrooms. Energy independence isn't a slogan to me. It's personal, it's survival. And if folks want to lecture me about values, let me tell you something. West Virginia values are not up for negotiation." He paused, then added with a tighter smile, "I didn't come here to argue with hashtags or to entertain ideological extremes. I came to speak truth, grounded in experience. And if that truth makes people uncomfortable, maybe it should." No one interrupted. Not yet. But something had shifted. The energy in the room had grown taut. Committee members glanced between one another, uncertain whether this hearing would unravel into another ceremonial dance, or something far more volatile. Chairman Halloran cleared his throat. "Thank you, Senator Manchin, for your opening statement," he said carefully. "We will now proceed with member questions in order of seniority." The names began to roll, one by one. Crockett remained silent. She was last, by design. Because sometimes the most devastating blow isn't the first, It's the one no one sees coming until the room is already on fire. But as the cameras reset and the first round of questioning began, it became clear that Manchin wasn't just there to testify. He was there to defend a legacy built on fossil fuel and finesse. The early questions came with diplomatic phrasing, dressed in the language of respect. But when Representative Bellerose asked about the Mountain Valley Pipeline, the temperature changed. Her tone was sharper, more surgical. Senator Manchin, could you clarify your continued support for the Mountain Valley Pipeline? Many critics argue the project threatens Appalachian ecosystems and tribal lands. What makes this necessary now, in 2025? Manchin didn't hesitate. His voice was steady, seasoned, and polished to a shine. The Mountain Valley Pipeline is critical to national energy security, he began, letting each word drop like a statement of record. We need redundancy, we need resilience, and we need jobs in communities that have been ignored for decades. This isn't just about gas, it's about sovereignty. He leaned back, hands folded, as if the answer was so obvious it required no follow-up. In his mind, this wasn't debate, it was doctrine. From the far end of the dais, Jasmine Crockett watched him, not with hostility, but with something colder, comprehension. She'd seen this before, how power disguised itself as patriotism, how profit hid behind phrases like forgotten communities. Then came a second question, this time from a congressman seated left of center. Senator, could you explain your current relationship with EnerSystems, the coal firm founded by your family? The pause before Manchin's response was less than a second, but enough for those who knew what to look for. He straightened, adjusted his sleeve. I haven't had an operational role in EnerSystems for years, he replied evenly. I stepped away. I don't run it. I don't make its decisions. His delivery was practiced, carefully legalistic, designed to sound like distance, while offering no true separation. Then with a quick breath he added, my shares are in a blind trust. My only focus is the American people. It was a clean answer, too clean, and it left a film in the air, something unseen but unmistakable. Crockett didn't speak. She didn't even shift in her seat. But in that moment, she stopped listening like a committee member and started listening like a prosecutor. But the room didn't stay quiet for long, because when silence falls around a lie, truth doesn't knock, it cuts. It started with a blink, just one red light beneath a dusty microphone, subtle, almost invisible, except to the chairman, who looked up with the slight hesitation of a man caught between routine and revelation. Representative Crockett, you're recognized, he said, voice cautious, as if sensing the tremor before the quake. She didn't rush. Jasmine Crockett adjusted her seat by half an inch, placed her hands deliberately on the table, and leaned into the microphone with the stillness of someone who already knew the answer to the question she was about to ask. Then why do you still receive over $500,000 in dividends from it each year? Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried with force, measured, clean, and surgical. She didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't lean back for effect. She simply delivered the line like evidence entered into record. The words slid across the room like a switchblade across silk. And then, nothing. Not a breath, not a shuffle. The silence was total, but not empty. It was packed with weight, shock, awareness, and something else no one wanted to name. Fear. Joe Manchin didn't flinch right away, but his smile faltered. Not enough to be obvious, but enough for the trained eyes in the room to catch. His hands, once gently steepled on the desk, tensed. A vein surfaced in his temple. His response didn't come immediately, because for the first time in that room, he wasn't in control of the pacing. The question hadn't been rhetorical. It hadn't been theatrical. It had been precise, and it came from someone everyone had underestimated. At the media platform in the back, a C-SPAN producer silently gestured to camera 2. The operator pivoted the lens away from the polished center and toward the far right corner of the dais. Slowly, dramatically, the feed reframed itself. Not on Manchin, the seasoned statesman, but on the woman in the navy blazer with ink-stained fingers and eyes like a locked safe. Jasmine Crockett didn't move, didn't blink. She didn't need to. The room was already rotating toward her, mentally, visually, emotionally. And in that frozen moment, her stillness said more than any outburst ever could. This wasn't a soundbite. It was a warning shot. The committee staff exchanged glances. The press corps sat forward in their seats. And somewhere outside, in homes and offices across America, viewers paused mid-scroll because they knew, without needing context, that something real had just cracked through the noise. She hadn't called him a liar. She hadn't accused him of corruption. She had simply said, "Explain it," with numbers, with truth, with no place left to hide. And suddenly, the burden of proof was no longer hers. The silence after her question was deafening. But Jasmine Crockett didn't come for silence. She came with proof. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. While Manchin tried to collect himself in the echo of her question, Jasmine reached under the table with the slow precision of a surgeon pulling a scalpel from its sheath. From a matte black folder, she drew a neatly clipped document, worn at the corners, but meticulously organized, and laid it on the desk with deliberate care. Her fingertips lingered on the cover, just long enough for the C-SPAN cameras to catch the gold-stamped title, Office of Congressional Ethics, Public Financial Disclosure Reports. She didn't look at Manchin. She didn't need to. Her eyes were already on the clerk. "With permission, Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice steady but edged with something heavier now, finality. Halloran nodded. The clerk retrieved the file, and within seconds, the central display screen above the witness table flickered to life. What appeared wasn't sensational. It was sterile, cold, government-issued truth, devoid of spin or commentary. A decade of dividend income from Enersystems, mapped by year. One by one, the numbers lit up, each a digit that could not be denied. $491,000 in 2015, $508,000 in 2018, $536,000 in 2018-2020, $552,000 in 2022. Each bar rose higher, a column of quiet indictment against the man now staring at them in real time. There was no dramatic music, no shouting, no pounding of fists. But the air in room 226 changed. It thickened, it darkened. The oxygen seemed to pull itself out of the walls. Manchin didn't move, but his jawline hardened and his fingers tensed. Subtle tells in a man trained to never show discomfort in public. He knew the numbers, but seeing them stacked on a federal screen, before peers, before the press, before the nation, that was a different kind of exposure. Crockett stood, not rushed, not showy, just upright, like someone who had nothing to prove and everything to confirm. She walked slowly to the screen, the only sound in the room the click of her heels on tile and the faint hum of fluorescent light. When she reached the edge of the display, she extended her arm and pointed at the red spike labeled 2022-$552,000. Her hand held there steady, fingers splayed like a highlighter underlining a sentence no one wanted read aloud. Then she said it. "And you opposed every single clean energy bill introduced during this period." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone was calm, deliberate, unshakable. The room heard every word, not because of volume, but because there was nowhere to run from them. In that moment, the screen wasn't just data, it was a mirror. And the image it reflected was one of power built not on public trust, but on private return. No one spoke. The silence wasn't out of respect. It was out of realization. Every person in that room, whether ally or opponent, now had to ask themselves the same question. Was it policy or payment? Crockett lowered her hand but didn't turn away. Her eyes remained on the screen, as if to say, "We're not done." And for the first time, the nation realized, neither was she. The data was undeniable. But when numbers threaten the throne, denial becomes the final line of defense, and Manchin wasn't ready to fall without a fight. For a long moment, he said nothing. His lips parted, but no sound came. He looked at the screen again. 10 years of cold, damning arithmetic glowing in front of him like a courtroom verdict etched in pixels. Then slowly Manchin sat forward, placing both hands on the table as if anchoring himself to the moment. His voice, when it finally emerged, was slower than before, tinged with forced calm, but every syllable carried the weight of a man slipping from control. "That's coincidental," he said. "I do what's best for my state. The words hung in the air like smoke over a fire already lit. He didn't elaborate. He didn't deny the money. He didn't refute the timeline. He just wrapped it all in a phrase that sounded like duty, but smelled like evasion. Instantly, the temperature in the room shifted. It wasn't shock anymore. It was disbelief. A ripple moved across the chamber, subtle but electric. Staffers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Reporters glanced up from their screens. Even Chairman Halloran furrowed his brow, the tip of his pen freezing above a notepad. Somewhere in the gallery, a low murmur broke out. A breath, a whisper, a warning. And then the sound grew, a rising tide of murmurs and disbelief, the kind that lives in spaces where the truth has just been challenged by a lie too thin to stand. But Crockett didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply turned her head slightly, just enough to study him. Really study him. Not like an adversary, but like a man unmasked. The silence she held now wasn't hesitation. It was strategy. Because in a room where every eye was suddenly watching, she didn't have to prove anything. He had just done it for her. But Crockett wasn't finished. Numbers were only the beginning. Now it was time to pull back the curtain on who had been feeding them. She reached into the folder again, her movements slow but sure, like someone unlocking the second chamber of a loaded weapon. What she pulled out next wasn't flashy, no bold graphics, no color-coded tabs. Just a thick packet of federal records, printed on plain white paper but heavy with implication. Across the top, Federal Election Commission, public contributions, energy sector, 2019 to 2024. The words alone told a story, but Crockett wasn't interested in stories. She was interested in names, amounts, and connections the public had never seen mapped together, until now. She handed the packet to the clerk, who, now visibly more alert, walked it to the screen system like it might explode. When the image appeared above the chamber, the room drew a collective breath. Unlike the financial disclosure charts, this one was messier. Lines and logos, donation arrows, amounts trailing like roots. But its message was crystal clear. Over $6 million in political contributions to Senator Manchin from companies directly tied to fossil fuel infrastructure, and more specifically, the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Crockett didn't dramatize the moment. She didn't pace or posture. She stepped forward once, folded her hands lightly in front of her, and began to read, not hurriedly, but with the gravity of someone delivering a public record, not a personal opinion. Dominion Energy, Next Era, EQT Corporation, TransCanada, Kinder Morgan, BlackRock Energy. She paused after each name, letting them land, each one its own thunderclap. With every company uttered, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Not speculation, not theory, but undeniable links between private power and public policy. Manchin, who had sat still through the financial disclosures, now shifted. He tugged at his tie, not because it had moved, but because the pressure had. His fingers tapped twice on the desk, his brow furrowed not with anger, but with calculation. He could feel the eyes on him, not just the committee, but the gallery, the press, the viewers watching this unfold on live streams, phones, TV sets. He leaned forward finally, his voice lower than before, but noticeably sharper, laced with restrained indignation. "You're making this personal," he said. "This is a character attack." For the first time in the hearing, there was a ripple, not just in sound, but in trust. Some members glanced up, others leaned back. The line had been drawn, but Crockett didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. Her response came like a blade, not wide, not wild, but surgically clean. "I'm questioning your qualifications to represent a nation," she said, each word sharpened by truth. "Not the balance in your wallet." There was no rebuttal, no noise, just impact. Her tone didn't ask for agreement. It demanded accountability. And suddenly, what had begun as just another hearing had turned into something else entirely. A reckoning, not just of numbers, but of motive. But when facts cornered him and the room shifted, Manchin didn't offer more evidence. He reached for an old weapon: condescension. He adjusted his chair with a quick jerk, elbows pressing harder against the table as if anchoring himself for a different kind of fight. The warmth he once used to charm the room had vanished. Now his voice sharpened, not with insight, but with indignation disguised as authority. "You come from Texas, Congresswoman," he said slowly, each syllable coated in the quiet venom of dismissal. "You don't know a damn thing about mountain economies." The insult wasn't accidental. It was engineered, to draw a line between them, between his kind of politician and hers, between the coal-covered hills of West Virginia and the oil fields and urban centers of Texas. It was the sound of an empire protecting itself, not with answers, but with hierarchy. Before anyone could react, he added with a slight tilt of the head, like a man delivering a final blow, "You're short-sighted in a long game, the kind of politics that trends on Twitter but disappears by Tuesday." The line was delivered smoothly, almost rehearsed, weaponized condescension dressed up as seniority. But the impact was unmistakable. Several committee members blinked. A few lips tightened. One aide's pen stilled in midair. The insult didn't just question Crockett's knowledge. It questioned her right to even be in the room. And yet she didn't flinch. No angry rebuttal, no theatrics. Just a silence that unsettled. Because in that stillness, Crockett was drawing breath not to react, but to strike. She smiled. Not the kind of smile that comes from amusement, but from recognition, from experience, from hearing that same tone in too many rooms, from too many men who believed their seat was birthright and hers was borrowed. Her chin rose slightly, enough for the gallery and cameras to catch the shift. The confidence didn't scream, it radiated. Then she leaned in, barely but with purpose. Her voice, calm and unwavering, landed like a scalpel cutting through layers of posturing and political noise. "The reason I can ask the question your people have been afraid to ask for decades," she said, "is because I don't take money from coal." No one moved. No one breathed. Because in those 21 words, she didn't just answer an insult. She reversed the room. She took every dollar tied to his name, every evasion wrapped in hometown pride, every deflection he had rehearsed for years, and she handed it all back to him, piece by piece, in front of the nation. She wasn't speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for the silenced. But Crockett wasn't done drawing lines. Now she was about to draw blood. Because corruption isn't always measured in votes or dollars. Sometimes it's measured in lives lost quietly, in places where no camera had ever gone. She turned back to the folder, her tempo slow now, like an executioner choosing the final blade. The room had settled into a strange silence, taut and brittle, everyone aware something heavier was coming. Crockett lifted a new file, thinner than the rest, but heavier in implication. She didn't need to explain what it was. The word Mylan in bold black letters said enough. The screen above flickered again. A simple image appeared. A closed gate, rusted chain, a sign that read Mylan Pharmaceuticals, permanently closed. Beneath it a caption, 1,400 jobs eliminated, Morgantown, West Virginia. No music, no commentary, just truth in its plainest form. She let the image breathe for a beat before she spoke. Her voice was softer now, but heavier. "This is the plant that shut down in 2021, she said. "The one that used to produce life-saving medications. The one that fed over 1,000 families in West Virginia. The one that left behind silence, dead in pain when it vanished." The lights from the cameras reflected off her eyes, but they couldn't catch the sharpness buried in her tone. "And this," she added, tapping her finger against the screen, "was overseen by Mylan's CEO at the time, Heather Bresch. Senator Manchin's daughter murmurs broke through the walls again, but this time they weren't just about numbers. They were about betrayal. Because it's one thing to profit from industry. It's another to watch your own constituents fall into poverty while your family sits in executive suites." Crockett wasn't just unraveling policy now. She was unraveling legacy, and it showed in the way Manchin shifted his jaw, as if trying to find the exact place where pride ended and liability began. She clicked to the next slide. This time it was a video, grainy CSPAN footage from 2016. The playback rolled without warning. Manchin's voice filled the chamber. My family has always stood with the working people of West Virginia. The clip ended. Abrupt, surgical, like a guillotine. She turned slowly toward Manchin, her expression unreadable, and asked the question she'd carried in silence long enough. "Who do you stand with now, Senator?" she said, eyes locked. "The unemployed workers your daughter left behind? Or the daughter in the corner office who signed the closure?" No noise followed. No one whispered. Because this wasn't drama anymore. This was exposure. The kind that couldn't be tweeted away or buried in PR statements. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse him of a crime. She simply laid the facts side by side and asked the question his own voters had been asking for years, with no one brave enough to echo them into a microphone. Her words were a mirror. Brutal, clean, reflective. And in that reflection, Manchin wasn't a senator. He was a father, a millionaire, a man whose name was stitched into the seams of decisions that cost people everything. Crockett stood still, the silence stretching longer than any in the room had heard that day. The screen behind her still showed the locked gates of the Milan plant, and for a moment it felt less like Congress and more like a courtroom. No one reached for their water. No one cleared their throat, because the question lingered, not in the air, but in the gut. Manchin didn't speak. Couldn't, perhaps. Not yet, because there are moments when political armor fails. And this was one of them. Crockett hadn't attacked him. She had simply asked him to answer. And that, in this room, was far more dangerous. But Crockett hadn't just come to expose financial records or question moral alignment. She came with receipts in the rawest form, his own voice captured in a moment he never thought would reach the public. She took a long breath, giving the room just enough space to settle back into stillness before delivering the final blow. Then, reaching into the folder one last time, she held up a small, labeled flash drive. There was no folder this time, no paper trail, just a silver stick no bigger than a pen cap, but far more dangerous. "Mr. Chairman," she said calmly, "I request permission to play a short audio clip submitted to my office by a former senior policy advisor who worked under Senator Manchin." Halloran raised an eyebrow, glanced toward legal counsel, and hesitated for half a breath. But something in the atmosphere, the precision of Crockett's pacing, the tension that hadn't left the air in 20 minutes, pushed him forward. "Proceed," he said, voice low. The clerk plugged in the drive. There was a pause. Then the room filled with static, soft, distant at first, then sharper as the audio calibrated. A door closed, papers rustled, then came the voice, grainy, unmistakable, and unfiltered. "Those damn climate activists, a bunch of obnoxious troublemakers. You cut off their money, they disappear. I'll make sure every one of their grants dries up before next budget cycle. Watch me." That was it. No music, no edits, no commentary, just Joseph Manchin's voice, raw and off script, saying exactly what he thought behind closed doors. There was no mistaking the cadence, the phrasing, the pride tucked behind contempt. He hadn't been arguing policy. He'd been targeting people, silencing opposition, not through debate, but through starvation. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was unnatural. It pressed against the walls, filled the cracks between every desk, every glance, every breath. Crockett didn't say a word. She didn't need to, because in that moment, he had spoken enough for both of them. Manchin's jaw clenched visibly, his brow furrowing with a mix of recognition and fury. He didn't deny it. He didn't speak. But the stillness of his body, the way his shoulders squared slightly, betrayed everything the room needed to know. He remembered saying it. And now, for the first time, he knew what it felt like to have his private arrogance dragged into public reckoning. The committee members sat frozen. A few stared straight ahead. Others dropped their eyes to their notes, unsure whether to look at him or at her. One congressman shook his head slowly, stunned. In the back, reporters had stopped typing. Their fingers hovered over keyboards as if words alone couldn't capture the moment. Chairman Halloran leaned forward, his fingers knit together, his lips tight. He exhaled hard through his nose. "Given the sensitivity of what we've just heard," he said carefully, "and the potential implications of this information, the committee will recess for 10 minutes. He tapped the gavel once. Sharp, abrupt. The sound cracked through the room like a starting pistol, but no one moved. Crockett didn't sit. She remained standing, still and poised, her chin lifted, but her expression unreadable. Not triumphant, not smug, just resolved. This wasn't a moment of victory for her, it was a moment of clarity for everyone else. Because when people heard that tape, they didn't hear a senator, they heard the machinery of political retaliation. They heard what it meant when power stopped listening and started punishing. And they heard what activists, whistleblowers, and frontline communities had known for years, that too often the system doesn't break. It protects itself until someone forces it to look in the mirror. And Jasmine Crockett, standing alone under fluorescent lights with only a flash drive and a spine of steel, had just held that mirror up to its face. The gavel fell. The room stood still, but the damage had been done. In the 10-minute break, the world had shifted, and now the walls would begin to crack. When the gavel dropped, the tension in the room snapped like a stretched wire. The committee members scattered in different directions, some heading for the back, others huddling in quiet conversation. But Crockett stood motionless, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. She didn't need the break. She didn't need a moment to compose herself. She knew exactly what was at stake, and it wasn't just the room. It was the very foundation of the political game that had kept people like Manchin at the top for decades. But as the minutes ticked by, the energy in the room began to shift. Members who had been silent, who had been complacent, now found their voices. They couldn't ignore the stain of the recording any longer. They couldn't act as though it didn't matter. One by one, their gaze flickered back to Manchin, who remained seated, his shoulders tense, his face drawn. He was still trying to steady himself, but the walls were closing in on him, slowly, methodically, until there was no escape. It started with a low murmur. A congressman from Pennsylvania stood up first, the words coming with less certainty than before. "Senator," he began, his voice noticeably softer than before, "your comment on climate activists." His words trailed off, but the room was already listening more closely. Another member, this time from Ohio, followed suit. "Senator, in your statement about blocking funding for climate change initiatives, wasn't that an abuse of power? Weren't you using your position to punish opposition rather than legislate?" The questions were coming faster now, each one landing with more weight, less hesitation. But the loudest message came from a quiet, subtle action. A movement so small, yet so profound, it could have been missed by anyone not paying attention. The congressman from West Virginia, who had long been Manchin's ally, who had worn the stand with Joe Pin proudly, slowly, deliberately unbuttoned his jacket and removed the small badge from his lapel. The soft rustle of fabric was the only sound in the room as the pin dropped to his desk with a quiet finality. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a signal, a sign of retreat, of turning away. Crockett saw it. The other committee members saw it. And, for the first time in the hearing, the pressure was on Manchin to explain himself, not just to Crockett, but to the very people who had once propped him up. Crockett, still standing, her back straight like the pillar of resistance she had become, watched as the room's dynamics shifted. But she wasn't done yet. She had asked her questions, but now it was time for a statement, a moment that would crystallize everything she had said up until that point. As her words cut through the charged silence, she didn't look at Manchin. She looked straight ahead, her voice rising in strength, steady but full of conviction. "We cannot fight for the people while wearing diamond rings gifted by the corporations they fear." The words hung in the air, sharp, cutting deeper than any question or accusation could. She wasn't just pointing to the money. She was pointing to the system that allowed men like Manchin to sit in their ivory towers, collect wealth from the very industries that harmed the people they were supposed to protect, and still claim to be the champion of the working class. She wasn't just attacking a man. She was attacking the unspoken power structure that allowed him to thrive while people like her, people like his constituents, struggled to make ends meet. Crockett's words were not just an accusation. They were a declaration. Her hands were steady, her eyes focused. She wasn't merely holding him accountable. She was exposing the hypocrisy at the heart of the system. The room remained still. No one moved. No one spoke. Manchin didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. His silence was as telling as any word he could have said. His gaze shifted downward, then back up, but his face was now a mask, tighter, more strained. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being questioned. Not like this. Not by someone who wasn't afraid to strip back the layers of his carefully cultivated image. The weight of what she had said was undeniable. The room felt the truth of her statement settling in like a storm cloud overhead. No one knew what would come next, but they all knew that something had changed. And for a moment, the whole political theater of it all seemed to disappear. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about party lines. It was about something much more fundamental. Who had the power to speak truth, and who was left silenced by their own corruption? Crockett's smile was small, not out of malice, but out of resolve. She didn't need to say more. The question had been asked. The line had been drawn. The room had felt the weight of her words. But Crockett wasn't done yet. Now she was about to expose not just the man before her, but the very system that allowed him to thrive. Crockett didn't move immediately. She let the moment breathe, letting the weight of her previous statement settle in the air like smoke after a blast. The room remained deathly still, no shifting in seats, no murmurs, just the sound of the room's collective heartbeat pounding in her ears. All eyes were on her now. The battle lines had been drawn, and she wasn't about to let them fade with the silence. She stood tall, her voice steady, but carrying a weight that no one could ignore. She picked up the folder with her notes, not as a crutch, but as a weapon. Her words now backed by the unassailable evidence she had just laid out. And then she spoke again. But this time, she didn't just ask questions. She delivered a judgment, one that would echo in the chamber for the rest of the day. "We cannot talk about climate justice," she began, her voice cutting through the thick silence, "when lawmakers are fed by the blood of coal." Her words landed, a direct hit. Manchin stiffened at the mention of coal, his lifeblood, his foundation. Crockett didn't shy away. She had watched families suffer under the false promises of men like him. She had seen the long lines at food banks, the schools closing, the hope that was slowly being choked by the very industries they were supposed to regulate. Her words were not just an accusation. They were a mirror. And the reflection it showed was one that Manchin, for all his political acumen, could not escape. The committee members didn't dare breathe. The air itself felt like it had thickened. They could feel the enormity of the moment, the weight of the truth Crockett had just unleashed. Manchin's face tightened, but he didn't respond. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes flickered nervously, betraying the facade he had maintained for so long. "And let me be clear," Crockett continued, her voice firm now, as if the very foundations of her statement had been set. "My party is not a refuge for those who sell their morals to keep their seat." She wasn't talking just about Manchin anymore. She was talking about the system, about a political machine that allowed men like him to profit off of public trust, about a party that, for too long, had turned a blind eye to corruption in the name of unity. Her words were not just a confrontation. They were a call to action. She wasn't just demanding accountability from Manchin. She was demanding it from every person in that room and every person watching from the outside. The room shifted again. It wasn't just Manchin that had been exposed. It was the entire framework of political expediency that had allowed the status quo to thrive. Crockett wasn't asking for reform. She was calling for a revolution of conscience. She wasn't here for polite discussions. She was here for truth. And then, as the tension reached its peak, the camera zoomed in on Manchin, capturing the shift in his demeanor. For the first time, his face fell. No more practiced poise. No more political mask. There was only the reality of what he had been caught in. The weight of the exposure pressed down on him, forcing his gaze to drop. For a moment, he was no longer the man in control. He was the man being questioned, scrutinized under the unforgiving light of public accountability. The cameras captured it all, the moment where his carefully crafted persona began to crack. His shoulders slumped, his eyes flickered to the side, as if searching for an exit. But there was none. No more words, no more deflections. He had been laid bare. Crockett stood, unmoving, not triumphant, but resolute. She had spoken truth, And in that moment, it wasn't just her voice that carried it. It was the collective voice of every person who had ever been silenced by power, by money, by influence. The room was still, but the silence spoke louder than any words ever could. Manchin had nowhere to hide. The hearing ended, but the impact did not. Truth once spoken in a room built to contain it had leaked out, into headlines, into living rooms, into history. As the gavel dropped for the final time, the hush that had gripped room 226 didn't vanish. It simply migrated. First into whispers, then into phone screens, then into a firestorm. By the time the committee doors swung open and the members filtered out into the marbled corridors of Capitol Hill, the hashtag Crockett and Manchin had already ignited across the nation. It didn't just trend, it exploded. Within hours, it climbed to the top of Twitter's national list, then global. Cable news anchors replayed Jasmine Crockett's final words in a loop, analysts breaking down each sentence like political scripture. On TikTok, young climate organizers stitched together clips of her cross-examination with protest footage from West Virginia, calling her the voice we've been waiting for. Overnight, what had begun as a committee hearing became a cultural reckoning. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, the silence from Manchin's office was deafening. His team issued no statement, no rebuttal, no correction. Aides confirmed he had not left his Senate office since the hearing ended. Curtains were drawn. Staff moved like ghosts. Reporters staked out the hallway, waiting for a glimpse, a quote, anything. But for 48 hours, there was nothing. No comment, no denial, just the echo of his own voice, caught on tape, bouncing through a nation suddenly unwilling to forget. Then came the blow that broke through even that silence. On the afternoon of the second day, the Office of Congressional Ethics released a terse but explosive statement. Due to the serious nature of evidence presented during the May 12th hearing regarding financial conflict of interest, the OCE is formally opening an investigation into Senator Joseph Manchin. It wasn't a leak, it was official, and it changed everything. News alerts lit up phones nationwide. Pundits, who only 2 days earlier had dismissed the hearing as mostly performative, now scrambled to explain the legal implications of what had been uncovered. Suddenly, this wasn't just a scandal, it was a test of institutional integrity. What would the Senate do with a man whose political record had just been shadowed by personal enrichment and private vendettas? And in the middle of the storm, Jasmine Crockett walked calmly toward the press briefing room. She wore no celebration, no smugness, only focus. The walls were plastered with camera lights. Dozens of microphones leaned toward her like drawn weapons. The questions came fast, layered, urgent. Some shouted over others, each trying to frame the moment through their own lens. But one voice cut through the chaos. A reporter from a major political network, her tone more curious than accusatory, asked what many had been thinking since Crockett began her line of questioning. Congresswoman Crockett, after what you've done here, are you afraid your party might move to expel you? There was no delay, no glance to advisors, no hedging. Crockett stepped forward, eyes steady, voice firm enough to halt every breath in the room. Her answer was not rehearsed, it was lived. If telling the truth is considered a crime, she said, each word measured like a verdict, then maybe the fault doesn't lie with me. Maybe it lies with a system that's been silent for far too long. The silence afterward was profound, not awkward, not performative. It was the kind of silence that follows revelation. That follows a line so honest it strips power down to its bones. The cameras zoomed in, not for drama, but because they had to. There was something undeniable in her expression. Not defiance, not pride. Something deeper, a kind of still-burning clarity only truth could produce. In that moment, Crockett didn't look like a member of Congress. She looked like something older, like justice that had finally found a voice. Across the country, her words flooded social media. Within minutes, quotes from her press conference were shared by climate activists, ethics watchdogs, and young progressive leaders. Major papers ran op-eds titled "What Crockett Said Out Loud" and "The Moral Line Has Been Drawn." Editorial boards that had once called for party unity began openly questioning why it took a freshman congresswoman to expose rot at the core of one of the Senate's longest-serving members. But the backlash came swiftly, too. From within her own party, whispers began. Senior Democrats, though silent in public, privately expressed discomfort. Some called her too aggressive. Others labeled her divisive. Behind closed doors, conversations turned to whether Crockett could be punished without appearing vindictive, if they could isolate her without martyring her. She knew, she felt it, that telling the truth in a system built on compromise comes at a cost. But Crockett also understood something most politicians forget. Some costs are worth paying. The next morning, she walked into her office as usual, head held high. On her desk, between stacks of memos and unopened letters, sat a single envelope with no return address. Inside was a note written in rough cursive. I lost my job when Milan shut down. I didn't think anyone would ever say what you said. You didn't just speak for West Virginia. You spoke for people like me. Thank you. She read it once, then again. Then she folded it carefully, placed it inside her jacket pocket, and walked out the door. Because the next hearing was coming, and this time, everyone would be watching. The gavel fell, but the tremor didn't stop at the wood. It rippled outward, into newsrooms, across phones, into group chats, city halls, union offices, rural kitchens, classrooms, churches, and digital town squares. Jasmine Crockett had not merely questioned a senator. She had called out the very skeleton of power that had held for decades, and America felt it. By the time the hearing room emptied, the hashtag # Crockett versus Manchin had already ignited across the nation. It didn't just trend, it exploded. Within hours, it climbed to the top of Twitter's national list, then global. Cable news anchors replayed Jasmine Crockett's final words in a loop, analysts breaking down each sentence like political scripture. On TikTok, young climate organizers stitched together clips of her cross-examination with protest footage from West Virginia, calling her the voice we've been waiting for. Overnight, what had begun as a committee hearing became a cultural reckoning. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, the silence from Manchin's office was deafening. His team issued no statement, no rebuttal, no correction. Aides confirmed he had not left his Senate office since the hearing ended. Curtains were drawn. Staff moved like ghosts. Reporters staked out the hallway, waiting for a glimpse, a quote, anything. But for 48 hours, there was nothing. No comment, no denial, just the echo of his own voice, caught on tape, bouncing through a nation suddenly unwilling to forget. Then came the blow that broke through even that silence. On the afternoon of the second day, the Office of Congressional Ethics released a terse but explosive statement. Due to the serious nature of evidence presented during the May 12th hearing regarding financial conflict of interest, the OCE is formally opening an investigation into Senator Joseph Manchin. It wasn't a leak. It was official, and it changed everything. News alerts lit up phones nationwide. Pundits, who only 2 days earlier had dismissed the hearing as mostly performative, now scrambled to explain the legal implications of what had been uncovered. Suddenly, this wasn't just a scandal, it was a test of institutional integrity. What would the Senate do with a man whose political record had just been shadowed by personal enrichment and private vendettas? And in the middle of the storm, Jasmine Crockett walked calmly toward the press briefing room. She wore no celebration, no smugness, only focus. The walls were plastered with camera lights. Dozens of microphones leaned toward her like drawn weapons. The questions came fast, layered, urgent. Some shouted over others, each trying to frame the moment through their own lens. But one voice cut through the chaos. A reporter from a major political network, her tone more curious than accusatory, asked what many had been thinking since Crockett began her line of questioning. Congresswoman Crockett, after what you've done here, are you afraid your party might move to expel you? There was no delay, no glance to advisors, no hedging. Crockett stepped forward, eyes steady, voice firm enough to halt every breath in the room. Her answer was not rehearsed, it was lived. If telling the truth is considered a crime, she said, each word measured like a verdict, then maybe the fault doesn't lie with me. Maybe it lies with a system that's been silent for far too long. The silence afterward was profound, not awkward, not performative, It was the kind of silence that follows revelation, that follows a line so honest it strips power down to its bones. The cameras zoomed in, not for drama, but because they had to. There was something undeniable in her expression. Not defiance, not pride, something deeper. A kind of still-burning clarity only truth could produce. In that moment, Crockett didn't look like a member of Congress. She looked like something older, like justice that had finally found a voice. The next few days were a whirlwind of interviews, protests, and sleepless nights. Jasmine Crockett had opened a door that many in Washington had tried desperately to keep closed. But what followed wasn't just a political battle. It was the price of speaking the truth in a place that thrives on compromise and silence. As the days passed, it became clear. The world outside was rallying behind her, but inside the halls of power, the real fight was just beginning. At first, the reaction was overwhelmingly supportive. Grassroots activists flooded social media with messages of thanks. Young people, particularly from marginalized communities, saw Crockett not as a politician, but as a symbol of what could be achieved when someone dared to speak plainly, without fear of the consequences. "She said what we were all thinking," one activist wrote on Twitter. "She finally called them out, all of them." Her inbox was flooded with messages from coal miners in West Virginia, teachers in Alabama, and single mothers in rural America, all saying the same thing: "Thank you." But even as her platform grew, so did the pressure. Back in Washington, the whispers started, conversations behind closed doors. Some members of her own party, once allies, started distancing themselves. The establishment could feel the weight of her challenge and saw it not as a battle against injustice, but a threat to their carefully balanced power. Within 72 hours of her explosive statements, a small but vocal faction of senior Democrats began to voice concerns. Some feared the potential fallout. What would this mean for the next election cycle? Would her stance alienate moderates or fuel the right wing's attacks? They were already discussing whether they could isolate her without making her a martyr. At the same time, Republicans, who had once laughed off her radical agenda, began to sense the change in the air. They weren't laughing anymore. Jasmine Crockett knew the stakes. She wasn't naive enough to believe that challenging a figure like Joe Manchin, one of the most powerful senators in the country, would come without cost. In fact, she had anticipated the pushback. But nothing could have prepared her for the quiet pressure that began to seep in from all sides. It wasn't the public that was the problem. It was the system itself. The committee hearings resumed a week later, but the air had shifted. As Crockett sat in her chair, the tension was palpable. Several members, once friendly, now looked at her with a mix of hesitation and suspicion. She had broken an unspoken rule, one that said that the game of politics was about diplomacy, not truth. A game where power was exchanged under the table, and public optics were carefully managed. One evening, as she was leaving her office, a senior Democratic congressman, someone she had worked with on several bills, pulled her aside in the hallway. "Jasmine," he said quietly, looking around as if to ensure no one was listening, "you've made your point, but you've also made enemies. The establishment's not happy with you. You've got to play the game. This isn't the way we do things here." His words hit harder than she expected. She had known the stakes, but to hear it so plainly from someone she had trusted stung. She nodded slowly, forcing herself to maintain composure. "I understand," she said, her voice calm. "But sometimes the game isn't worth playing if it's rigged from the start." The congressman gave her a tight-lipped smile, the kind people use when they know you've made your choice, but they don't agree with it. "Just remember, you can't fight this fight alone." But she wasn't alone. Not really. Outside, her base of support was growing every day. The call to action that she had sparked was palpable. Grassroots organizations, union leaders, and environmental groups, people who had long been left behind by a broken political system, were now seeing Crockett as their advocate, their voice. Donations poured into her campaign. Volunteers called her office, asking how they could help. The American public was responding to something they hadn't seen in years: a politician who was willing to take a stand, even when it meant going up against the establishment. Still, as her support grew, so did the scrutiny. The media, initially focused on the scandalous revelations about Manchin, began to dig deeper into Crockett's background. Reporters combed through her voting history, her previous speeches, searching for something, anything, that could undermine her credibility. It wasn't just Manchin who had enemies in Washington. Now she had them too. In the days following her press conference, a second wave of stories emerged, this time aimed squarely at her. Critics called her reckless, too bold, a threat to party unity. The attacks were not as public as the media coverage of Manchin's corruption, but they were there, whispered into the ears of influential figures in Congress, shared behind closed doors, and printed in op-eds that claimed her methods were too extreme. But Crockett didn't back down. If anything, the attacks fueled her resolve. She had come into this job with one purpose: to represent those who had been ignored for too long. The coal miners, the teachers, the working-class families who had been left behind by both parties. She would not let the fear of losing her place at the table silence her. Meanwhile, Manchin, whose position had seemed unassailable for so long, was now struggling to regain his footing. He hadn't left his office for 48 hours after the ethics investigation was announced. His staff confirmed he was preparing a response, but no one knew when or how it would come. His silence was his way of reasserting control, but in doing so, he had revealed just how much power he was losing. The public investigation into his conflicts of interest was a turning point, one that no amount of political maneuvering could easily undo. And Crockett knew this was only the beginning. The media would continue to cover the story. The pressure would mount. But now the question wasn't whether Manchin would survive the investigation. It was whether the system that had allowed him to thrive would survive the scrutiny she had sparked. In the days that followed, Crockett found herself faced with yet another question. What price would she pay for this fight? The pressure from inside her party had begun to mount. Some leadership members suggested she tone down her rhetoric, be more diplomatic. They knew as she did that she was standing on dangerous ground. If they couldn't control the narrative, they would risk losing it all. But Crockett wasn't afraid. She had already paid a price, one that was too high for her to back down now. She had stood up, and the people had responded. It was no longer just about her. It was about all those who had been silenced, about all those who had been ignored. She had spoken the truth, and now the cost of that truth would be measured not in popularity or party loyalty, but in something far more important: the integrity of the fight itself. As the story reached its peak and the battle lines were drawn, there was one truth that couldn't be ignored. The cost of fighting for what's right isn't just paid in votes, it's paid in silence, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand alone. The aftermath of the investigation and the growing tension inside and outside Congress exposed more than just the fight between one woman and one senator. It revealed the nature of a system that thrives on silence and complicity, one that encourages a facade of fairness while supporting those who play the game by bending the rules. Jasmine Crockett wasn't simply challenging Joe Manchin. She was challenging an entire political ecosystem, one built on backdoor deals, unspoken alliances, and the quiet suffering of everyday people who never got a seat at the table. In a world where personal ambition often trumps public good, where corporate interests outweigh the voices of the people, speaking out against the powerful carries consequences. It always has. But Crockett's willingness to take that stand, despite the price, was a powerful reminder of the human cost of truth and justice. What she faced was more than just opposition from political figures who felt threatened by her actions. It was a system built to keep people like her in their place. Every move she made, every word she said, had consequences far beyond her own career. The pressure from her own party, the attacks from the opposition, and the strain on her personal life were all parts of the heavy toll she paid for choosing to fight for the people, not for political gain. Manchin, a man who had spent years climbing the political ladder, was not just a symbol of power. He was a symbol of the system itself, one that took more than it gave, one that rewarded loyalty over integrity, and one that used the very resources meant to uplift communities as tools to further its own agenda. His reaction to Crockett's questions wasn't just a defensive move. It was a reflection of a deeper fear, the fear of losing control, the fear of a system that had held power for so long being exposed for what it truly was. But Crockett didn't back down. In fact, the more they tried to silence her, the louder her voice became. She understood the risks, the personal sacrifices, and the price that came with it. But she also understood that sometimes standing up for the truth means standing alone. It means not waiting for others to agree with you, but doing what's right anyway. Her journey was a stark reminder of the role each of us plays in upholding justice. It's easy to sit back and wait for change to happen, to hope that others will fight the battles that matter. But as Crockett's story unfolded, it became clear that real change doesn't come from waiting. It comes from taking risks, from challenging the status quo, and from being willing to pay the price for the greater good. It comes from the belief that the truth, no matter how painful, will always rise to the surface if given the chance. Crockett's message wasn't just for the people in that room or the viewers watching from home. It was for everyone who had ever felt powerless, marginalized, or ignored. It was for the workers whose jobs were taken away by corporate greed, for the families who suffered in silence because they didn't have a voice in the conversation. It was a call to arms for the people who were tired of seeing the same faces in power, who were tired of promises made and never kept. She was fighting for them, the ones who were afraid to speak out because they feared the consequences, the ones who had been let down by a system that wasn't designed to help them. Her refusal to be silenced was the beginning of a larger movement, one that was fueled not by ambition or personal gain, but by a genuine desire to restore justice. And as the pressure mounted, it became clear that the fight she had started wasn't just for one election cycle or one political issue. It was for a future where the system could be reshaped, where power could be reclaimed by the people it was meant to serve. But even as the movement grew, Crockett faced opposition that sought to diminish her message. There were whispers from her colleagues, quiet conversations behind closed doors, questioning her methods, her approach, and her willingness to disrupt the flow of politics as usual. They called her reckless, naive, and too bold. But the truth she spoke was never reckless, it was necessary. Her boldness wasn't born from a desire for recognition. It was born from a deep, unshakable belief that change could only come if people like her were willing to risk everything to make it happen. As the days passed, the pressure continued to mount. The media scrutinized every move she made, and her allies began to distance themselves, unsure of how to support a figure who was shaking the foundation of their own comfortable positions. But Crockett remained resolute. She didn't let the whispers or the criticisms pull her off course. She knew the stakes. She knew the risks. And still, she stood. The real lesson of her journey wasn't just about confronting a corrupt system. It was about the costs of speaking truth to power. It was about understanding that when the system is rigged, the only way to change it is to break it. And that's what Crockett did. She broke the system open with her questions, with her refusal to accept the status quo, and with her unwavering belief that the people's voice deserved to be heard. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.